Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are poems that have been told for thousands of years and have shaped storytelling within Western culture. Odysseus' journey is foundational to the cores of heroism. The Odyssey specifically dealing with themes of heroism, loyalty, hospitality, and perseverance through unbearable odds. Despite the story being so foundational, there's been no true adaptation of it into a cinematic format that has resonated with general audiences. In fact, the adaptation of the Odyssey that has the highest acclaim at this point in time is the film Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? A film following a journey through 1937 Depression-era America, which incredibly adapts the themes and character journey of the Odyssey. However, obviously the setting makes it clearly not a page-to-screen adaptation of the story. When one of the most acclaimed directors in the history of Hollywood, Christopher Nolan, was announced to be directing an adaptation of the Odyssey, I was cautiously optimistic. Nolan excels in on-screen cinematography and has directed one of my personal favorite movies in The Dark Knight.
I'm not wearing hockey pads.
He has developed a staunch anti-CGI stance, which in the era of Disney and superhero slop is seen as a nice change to the norm. That being said, however, when Nolan creates his films, he often feels a need to ground his stories to a more believable or explainable sense in the world. For example, in The Dark Knight Rises, Nolan changes the concept of the Lazarus Pit from Ra's al Ghul's resurrection tank to being a prison in the middle of the desert that can heal spine breakage via punches to the back.
Protruding from your back. It has to be put back.
This style Nolan does with the grounding presents a problem with adapting the Odyssey specifically. Odysseus' journey is massively influenced by the Greek pantheon. Aphrodite causes all the drama with Helen in Paris, Athena helps Telemachus on his journey, and obviously Odysseus himself. Hermes intervenes on behalf of Zeus and Athena. Poseidon is massively enraged with Odysseus, disrupting his journey home. The idea that Nolan might not include those gods into this story led me with the concern that it was gonna be bad. Before I go into my review, it is worth noting that this movie is performing extremely well at the box office, which is to be expected because of Christopher Nolan. Obviously, box office success means nothing with the true quality of a movie. However, it can serve as a sign of how the general public feels towards it. A movie performs well, that means people likely enjoyed it enough to go back. If it tanks, people probably didn't care or heard poor things about it and chose to spend their money elsewhere. I watched this movie in IMAX, and walking out of the theaters, like almost any Christopher Nolan movie, I didn't really feel like it was a complete waste of my time. Outside of Tenet and The Dark Knight Rises, I've never really watched a Christopher Nolan movie that I thought was just completely awful. My opinion tends to vary on the scale of meh to really liking it, and with The Odyssey, I came out of the theater and thought it was mid. I hadn't read The Odyssey in a few years since high school, so my familiarity with the story was not exactly fresh in my mind. However, because I do remember elements, themes, and character journeys loosely, I left the theater feeling uncanny, and as I refamiliarized myself with the original poem, it became clear this film is not the Odyssey, and in fact, it's a complete subversion of it. We will go more specifically into the adaptation and subversion of it later, but for now, I will review this film as its own standalone story. There are plenty of shots and sequences in this movie that look amazing, as to be expected with Nolan. That being said, at the same time, I feel like this movie made very poor use of some of the real environments they shot in. There's no real difference in appearance between the interior of the palace in Ithaca and the palace of Sparta, to name a certain example. The color correction applied to this movie and color palette as a whole of the film is extremely bland and boring to look at. While that likely was chosen to try to relay this tone of the film, it very much decolorizes the ancient world that should have a lot more color in it. The lack of color and lingering shots really removes any feeling of grandness and epicness from the film. In the behind the scenes of the film, there's so much more color and liveliness in like the ocean as an example, and the rest of the world around it than there is in the movie specifically. The lack of grandiosity in this film is very strange and absolutely derails this from feeling like a true Odyssey and epic. Along with the cinematography of Nolan being there, like almost every film, the same problems with audio mixing that he does is also prevalent. Nolan has a gigantic problem with mixing audio in his movies. That's most well seen in Tenet, which is the most extreme example of this flaw, but it's also in The Odyssey, it's in Interstellar, it's in a lot of things. In fact, the sound as a whole is an issue in this movie. The score by Ludwig Göransson is not great. 90% of the soundtrack is just drums. The only unique song is the one over the siren scene, and I don't personally like it that much. I think the music that played over the pig transformation scene was decent, but outside of those two, there's not much of note to this. The dialogue, when you can hear it, however, is just Absolutely awful. 75% of this film basically is just exposition with no response. Telemachus in this movie is basically just walking through an outlet mall of exposition and receiving different dumps from it. It's not Multiverse of Madness Memory Store bad, but it's honestly not much better. There's a moment where Odysseus literally does refer to themselves as being in the Bronze Age. In fact, the line and the exact quote I think is, "Our age of bronze is coming to an end." The choice of American accents was also not good. American history is 250 years old, so attaching the accent to a story that is thousands of years old gives a strange feeling when listening to characters talk. It's something that would have made me lose my immersion in the story if I had made it that far. However, to be honest, I lost all hope in being immersed in the story when the first thing you see on screen is Travis Scott.
Travis Scott is here! The Jack Boys are in the building!
Travis Scott was one of many casting choices that were questionable, to say the least. But to be honest, I don't even think those were remotely the biggest issue in this story. And the real problem came with the acting as a whole. Everybody except basically Robert Pattinson and Anne Hathaway played themselves, or their most infamous basic version. The Menelaus and Telemachus scene could basically just be a scene from Spider-Man Brand New Day where Punisher tells Spider-Man all about Odysseus. Odysseus is kind of a giant idiot in the movie. First off, they build the Trojan horse in a spot where it can be submerged by water so men can drown. When his men leave Troy, they point out they aren't following Agamemnon, who is on the known routes, and he just says he'd rather go an unknown way and just hope they find food. He shoots an arrow that can do nothing at a Cyclops that only gets more of his men endangered, and rarely in this movie has any form of real cleverness. There are a couple changes and expansions in this story that take stuff from the poem and make it a little more in-depth that I think work decently well. I think the scene additions to Argos the dog made the payoff a little more meaningful. I personally didn't feel much because Hollywood has used the kill the dog trick so much that it ruins this well-done one for me, but that's not a flaw of this movie, that's a flaw of storytelling in general at this point in movies. The strumming of the bow from Odysseus was a nice expansion of a small line in the book. It had some setup that led to a great payoff before he killed the suitors of Penelope, realizing what was about to happen, and he's about to hunt these men in his house, just like he would strum the bow when he was about to hunt a deer. I think ultimately, you just can't separate the fact that this story is a subversion of the original poem. The story itself is not a heroic homecoming, is instead a heroic deconstruction, which leads to a weird feeling of dissatisfaction when the movie ends. The end of Odysseus sailing into the unknown west, abandoning his island to his son, who has done nothing to really prepare for rule, and basically says, "Well, son, civilization is collapsing, good luck, I'm out." It feels like Nolan watched Return of the King, where Frodo sails to the Undying Lands, and just wanted to include that in his movie, so he took the line about Odysseus sacrificing for Elpenor and the other men, and just decided to expand that and make that the end of his movie. In general, as a movie, I don't really think I'll ever watch it again or feel the want to watch it again. Initially, I thought this movie was more mid, and as it had time to sit with me, my opinion definitely soured on it. I think it's a flawed movie that overall is not great, lacking a lot of grandiosity in how it's shot to portray the epic it's supposed to be. I do believe the Odyssey is so foundational to modern storytelling that it's important to look at it compared to the poem and explain where the subversion lies and why it does not work. When it comes to adapting a previous story, whether it be a poem, book, or a video game, creatives in filmmaking have often struggled with successfully doing it. The most common example, I feel like, is with video games these days. For whatever reason, filmmakers tend to massively struggle with adapting those stories. My best guess is because they often view video games as beneath them, or their egos prevent them from faithfully adapting it and wanting to tell their own stories with a pre-built-in fan base. I'm personally not militaristic when it comes from page-to-screen adaptation and faithfulness in your story. However, if changes are made, they need to be just as good or better. As long as core ideals and themes are carried from the original work, I personally think they can still be very good stories. For example, Spider-Man Homecoming as a movie is objectively a terrible adaptation of Spider-Man comics. Yet the core ideals of Spider-Man's character, the ideals of personal sacrifice, obviously with great power comes great responsibility, and the heroic mindset of Peter are abundantly present within Homecoming. I think it's a phenomenal movie, even though it's a very bad page-to-screen true adaptation of the origin of the comic book Spider-Man character. That being said, if anybody chooses to despise an adaptation because it changes the source material, I understand that wholeheartedly, and you won't catch any pushback from me. To connect this to the Odyssey, the film Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is a phenomenal movie. Nobody would try and claim it's a page-to-screen great version of Homer's original poem. However, the quality of the film is completely engrossed with how it pushes the same structure, character journey, and themes of the Odyssey. Looking at the film in the simplest of terms, it would seem as if Nolan's Odyssey is the same as Homer's Odyssey. Following the Trojan War, Odysseus' journey home is massively derailed, leading him into trials and tribulations that challenge Odysseus and kill his men. While this is happening, his son Telemachus is on a journey of his own to learn about his father, while suitors fill his house and pursue his mother and Odysseus' wife Penelope. So the film does hold the bare bones of Homer's original Odyssey. However, bare bones is about where the plot alignment between both Odysseys comes to a close. This movie does have some moments I like I stated earlier. The start of the Cyclops sequence is intriguing and well done. The body horror scene where Circe turns his men into pigs is eerie, disgusting, and incredible. I think it might be the strongest individual scene in this movie, in fact. I like the action sequence just after the Greeks exit the Trojan horse. I'm not in love with how that scene ends, but I like the scene prior to it. The issues that a lot of these sequences hold for me come from the payoffs these scenes create. As previously stated when it comes to adaptation, I am fine if somebody wants to change or alter the piece of media they're adapting, given that what they add or take the place or change is better or still of decent quality and value. However, that does mean if something is altered and the outcome is far worse, then the adaptation should receive extremely harsh criticism. A lot of the parts I enjoyed in this film are the parts that are things that are pulled directly from the poem, whereas the parts I didn't enjoy were often original additions or changes made. The Cyclops sequence of Nolan's Odyssey adapts one of the most infamous trials of Odysseus. In the original poem, Odysseus displays his cleverness and cunning to escape the cave of the Cyclops. While we'll go more explicitly into the change of his character later, in the poem, both Odysseus' flaws and strengths lead him and his men both into the problem and back out of it. In the film, Odysseus and his men follow a sheep into the cave of Polyphemus. Odysseus and his men are then trapped in the cave. Polyphemus eats some of Odysseus' men, but they cannot kill the Cyclops because he is the only one who can move the rock blocking the entrance. The design of the creature I actually really like. It's freakish and very uncanny in the movie. Some of Odysseus' men escape the cave, but Odysseus goes back. He then comes up with a plan to tie grass or hay to their backs so they feel like sheep when they brush against the touch of the Cyclops. Then they blind Polyphemus. Polyphemus then calls out to Poseidon. The men escape the cave, and out of anger, Odysseus shoots Polyphemus with an arrow. The arrow does absolutely nothing, yet enrages Polyphemus into chasing his men down and trying to attack their boats as they flee. There is no discussion between Odysseus and Polyphemus. You could technically describe the tying the grass to them as clever or cunning, but I don't really think it's all that impressive. Odysseus' decision to shoot an arrow at the Cyclops does not make much sense and is really only stupid. The arrow does nothing, especially considering how gigantic Polyphemus is. He's mad Polyphemus ate some of his men, so he throws a toothpick at him. The opening of the sequence is pretty good, yet the character decisions and changes don't work very well, and from a story standpoint, it's not paced very well. The Cyclops set piece is one example of just many in this film where plot points are strangely derailed because of pointless changes. To go with the plot, the idea of Zeus's law plays a central core part in the theme and plot of the story. The concern over the sea people is all across the ancient world. It is a concern in Ithaca that the lack of a leader means they will not be ready if the sea people, a band of travelers which come from the sea ignoring all known customs, attack their island. The ultimate reveal is that the sea people are actually Odysseus and his men, because the Trojan horse as a gift represents the dissolution of Zeus's law, functionally disrupting the basic rules of society. The Greek idea of Xena has relevance within the story of Homer's Odyssey. When Athena appears in Ithaca, Telemachus immediately offers the stranger Greek hospitality. Whereas when Odysseus and his men greet Polyphemus, the Cyclops immediately asks for their names instead of offering hospitality to support them. In Nolan's Odyssey, he takes this rule of Zeus's law, and as opposed to the law simply just being the law that applies to hospitality when a stranger enters your home, he changes it so that the law applies to all aspects of life, including warfare. The big reveal that Odysseus and his crew were the real sea people is, to be frank, quite awful. The Trojan horse is treated as the original sin of this society because it violated Zeus's law. The reason this doesn't make much sense is that this war in and of itself began from Paris running away with Menelaus' wife Helen. I think stealing another guy's wife would probably break Zeus's law. Or even by that logic, when the Greeks arrived at the gates of Troy, the Trojans should have invited them into their city and fed them, I guess. The point being, it's clearly obvious that the rules of ancient hospitality would really have no place in warfare of itself. In the original poems, the Trojan horse is a genius invention during a time of war. Odysseus is a great hero of the war, and it doesn't weigh on him as some grave sin. This, as a choice, fundamentally changes the theme of Odysseus' journey and the story as a whole, and it's not done for the better. The core plot of Nolan's Odyssey, when you look past the surface level, is not an adaptation of the Odyssey. It just uses the bare bones to tell a Vietnam War story. Let me explain. The sons of rich and powerful men on Ithaca dodge the draft to go fight in Agamemnon's war. The war itself is called to under false pretenses. While it's claimed to be over Menelaus' wife, it's truthfully because Agamemnon wants to rip away Troy's control over the trade routes. So a war where the rest of the population doesn't quite believe in the higher-ups' justification for it. While away at the war, Odysseus partakes in actions he's not proud of, creating his own dissolutions with his leader and home. He worries about returning home because of the actions he committed. He deals with PTSD with a therapist who gives him opioids to alter his state of mind and begins to wean him off when his mind is ready to return to normal. Odysseus has concerns with his wife potentially having an affair back home. Again, see, it's a Vietnam movie. Now, if you want to adapt the story in your own way, a key core to that is by maintaining the basic structure and theme of the characters' journeys as the original work did. Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings removes and adds stuff from Tolkien's original work. However, the themes, character journeys, and payoffs all connect back to Tolkien's books. The movies themselves would suck massively as adaptations if the movies were actually a Great Depression film following Frodo Baggins as a stand-in for the 1930s American. If a change like that was done correctly, the film can still be good, but it would be questionable as to why it was adapted with that IP's name originally. The anti-war Zeus's Law theme is extremely weak in its execution through the movie. There are moments such as with Circe when she immediately ignores Zeus's law and instead turns Odysseus' men into pigs. This is a direct violation of these supposed norms, yet she receives no punishment for her apparent ignorance of these norms of hospitality. She gives an absurd, rampant speech to Odysseus about how pigs are all his men were, and her turning them into pigs was some form of self-defense. Yet, everything we saw from Odysseus' men was nothing but being good, respectful guests. Circe is treated as a victim of past trauma of some kind, and is allowed to just break these customs with no repercussions. Odysseus himself implying killing her would make the gods angry with his men. In the poem, Odysseus has an affair with Circe, which is the reason she isn't killed, but nothing like that happens in this movie. Leaving Circe's island is when Odysseus travels to Hades. In the poem, this is where the character of Elpenor dies. Elpenor is not in this story and is instead replaced by the character of Sinon, a different soldier from the Trojan War, but more on him later. When Odysseus travels to Hades in the poem, he meets all kinds of different shades, including notably that of Achilles. Achilles appears to be a leader among the dead. He provides a message in the poem saying he'd rather live his life as a slave on Earth than rule the dead in Hades. Now, because the poem is so rich with its exploration of deep themes, this actually gives a view that can be seen as anti-war in a sense. Achilles pointing out there is no fulfillment in the life you live if you die young in war, ironically aligns perfectly with Nolan's message in this movie. It's ironic because this scene is not included in this movie at all. Instead, Odysseus speaks with Tiresias, Agamemnon, and Sinon. The opportunity to take some of Homer's work to tie back to your theme is completely missed, and to be honest, it could have made for an awesome moment in the film had, like, Brad Pitt made a cameo reprising his role from Troy as a broken down Achilles. Hades as a whole is rather underwhelming. It could have been a massively epic sequence, but Nolan's insistence on practicality means it just kind of feels bleh. It was just black sands in Iceland, which, cool aesthetic. The problem is soldiers covered in mud and being dirty. It's really not that different from the rest of the movie. While the journey of the Odyssey is what is often thought about, at the end of the day, the epic is truthfully a character drama. Whether it be Penelope's loyalty to her husband despite his 20-year absence, the drama between the Greek pantheon, or the flaws and strengths of the hero Odysseus. Perhaps the most glaring subversion of Nolan's film is that of its main character, Odysseus. The infamous nobody ploy from the poem is not in this film. It's entirely omitted, in fact. In the poem, when Polyphemus walks into his cave, he asks for Odysseus' name, to which he answers his name is Nobody. This is so later when Odysseus and his men blind the Cyclops, he yells out to his neighbors that nobody is trying to kill him. It's a little foolish in that sense, but overall shows the cleverness that Odysseus displays. After all, this is the mastermind behind the Trojan horse, an invention that ended the 10-year Greek-Trojan War. The plan to blind the Cyclops is so the men can cling to the undersides of the rams and sheep that have come into the cave to sneak out past the Cyclops. The moment provides also some levity, which would have been much appreciated in this story, with nobody and having the Cyclops yell that nobody is trying to kill him and the ploy working could be a little humorous, and I think would have benefited this movie greatly. Upon escaping back to their boats, Odysseus' pride and hubris gets the better of him, and he wants the Cyclops to know who blinded him, so he yells his true name out to the Cyclops. In the film, Odysseus angrily shoots the Cyclops with a bow, which endangers him and his men from even reaching the boats because he's a complete idiot. We never see Odysseus as the legendary hero, and the men on his ships have no character. There's basically one guy on the boat who just represents the whole crew. Because his men have absolutely no character, and we never see the admiration of Odysseus as a war hero, the decision to mutiny against him is weightless with no logic behind it. What perhaps is most illogical about it is that it comes after the Lystragonian scene, in which there was nothing Odysseus really could have done. They got out of their boat, they walked into the forest, they tried to run away, and the forest moved. I don't know what Odysseus could have done better there to keep his men from deciding Odysseus shouldn't lead anymore. This passive and broke Odysseus is the character we're stuck with, and that leads to the scene with the sirens being absurdly out of character. The Odysseus of the poem is extremely prideful. He wants to be the man who hears the song of the sirens and lives to tell the tale. The Odysseus of the movie would have no care for that because he's ashamed of the heroic myth attached to his name. While I ultimately think Matt Damon is fine as the character in this movie, it's undeniable that this is ultimately not the character of Odysseus. The film can never be a good adaptation of the story because Odysseus literally does not want to come home. He regrets the war in Troy so much he either intentionally or subconsciously avoids returning home, according to him. That in and of itself prevents this from being a good adaptation of the Odyssey. Could you imagine in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings if Sauron came up to Frodo in the Shire when he has the ring and just goes yeah, you can keep that, Frodo. You're good. I don't even want it that. I don't even want the ring that badly. It's all good, man. You can just hold on to that. You took the core foundational journey of Odysseus trying to get home and was what if you didn't really want to come home that badly? That doesn't work when you're trying to adapt that story. A man who's translated the Odyssey, David Mendelsohn, put it best in his excellent review of the film, in which he explained just the flaw with how Odysseus is characterized. He first cites a quote from the movie. "We left them a gift, an offering of peace that they took into their home. We violated all that is held sacred between people and turned a fight into a hunt. To burn the walls of Troy was to burn the world entire. What if Odysseus knew that very night, as he walked through the fires of anarchy and pain and in the days of sweaty celebrations that followed? What if he knew exactly what he'd done?" Mendelsohn, speaking on his review of this speech specifically, said, "As this resounding speech echoed in my ears, it occurred to me that it sounds nothing like the heroes of Homer, who after all gleefully vaunt over the mutilated bodies of their slaughtered enemies, but a lot like the heroes of Christopher Nolan movies. This tormented, guilt-ridden Odysseus, stripped of humor and wit, seductiveness and cleverness, is a sibling of Memento's anguished amnesiac, of Batman, of Oppenheimer, men agonized by pasts they wrestle with in different ways." The rest of Mendelsohn's review is linked below. I would highly recommend it. It's an excellent piece of work from a man who is very well versed in the subject of the Odyssey. Odysseus is not the only character changed drastically, but to be honest, if I went through every single one, this video would be 50 hours long. So I will instead talk about Odysseus and now Sinon. Sinon is turned into a martyr of sorts for Odysseus. It's really quite weird. He's supposed to tie in the through point of hospitality and anti-war. Robert Pattinson's character of Antinous drew a lot to fight in the war, but instead of taking it, he swaps it with Sinon, promising to support his family. Turns out he lied and he didn't. Anyway, Sinon does not appear in the Iliad or the Odyssey, but is central to the story of the Trojan horse. The Greeks needed a way to get the Trojans to bring the horse into the city, so Sinon was chosen to stay outside of the horse. It depends on which version of the story you follow next, but there are some where the Trojans come to Sinon and torture them. Sinon refuses to speak to the Trojans until he is tortured so thoroughly, in some versions he has his nose cut off, in which he finally tells them that they built the horse too big because it was a gift to the gods. However, if the Trojans had taken it inside the walls, their city would be protected. Sinon knows the truth that inside are the soldiers. However, his torture is what seals the deal, and the Trojans bring the horse inside, thinking they're clever. Once inside, again, there are versions where Sinon is actually responsible for signaling the remaining ships to travel to begin the war inside. Sinon is incredibly cunning, but perhaps his most important and impressive feat is not revealing the secret of the Trojan horse, embracing the torture to seal the lie. Sinon is actually so synonymous with his ability to lie, he appears as a symbol of lying in Dante's Inferno. In Nolan's film, however, he was not told any of that. Odysseus lies to Sinon, not telling him about the men inside. When Sinon Shade questions the choice, Odysseus says it's because dying men tell the truth. Sinon is killed in front of Odysseus and never receives a burial for his death, which is why Odysseus goes into exile at the end of the movie. There's some whole message about Sinon being so brave or whatever in this movie, but yet again, we have a scenario where if the character from the story Sinon is in had been actually implemented, that version of the character, the through line of this moment would have been a much better payoff and tied back to Nolan's theme. All of this builds to the point that this movie really is too long and too short. It wastes so much time. Basically, all of Telemachus' journey is incredibly pointless. Menelaus basically just tells him about Odysseus and then they leave. The suitors back home are relatively irrelevant, and while Telemachus is on his journey, every Penelope scene back in the house is just pointless as a whole. It's repeated information that we already know. Penelope really wants to be queen of Ithaca. She wants Odysseus back. We hear this about 30 times. Antinous as a character, while being probably the most well acted, is too modern in how he speaks. It doesn't work in this era of story that Nolan's trying to push. Ultimately, Nolan's Odyssey is a box office hit that's filled with flaws, and when it comes to adaptation, it's one of the worst adaptations I've seen in a while. The film itself has some nice shots and scenes, yet that's paired with a confused plot, putrid dialogue, and just absolutely awful pacing, which leads me overall saying this is not that good of a movie. It's definitely not Nolan's worst because, let's face it, Dark Knight Rises still exists, but I don't see this being held in high regards as one he's remembered for. When Nolan's career is finished and people are discussing his great accomplishments, I doubt the Odyssey is one that will long be remembered. Had he actually adapted the story, done a trilogy or a series, I guess, this could have been one of Hollywood's great accomplishments of the recent era. But ultimately, I don't think that movie reaches that height. Once the discussion of how amazing this movie looks in IMAX and how awesome it is on the big screen dies down and is done as it comes out to streaming, I do wonder if people who love this movie so much will watch this on VOD and be confused at why they don't enjoy it as much. The subversion of Odysseus' character left me leaving the theater feeling completely unsatisfied. But ultimately, the issue is that this movie, and by an extent Christopher Nolan, tried to subvert a foundational story that has been told for thousands of years, and ultimately, I don't quite think it worked out. If you made it this far, consider subscribing, leave a like if you enjoyed, and drop a comment down below. You can tell me how wrong I am. But as always, thanks for watching.